Well, it's good to be with you. Thanks for the invitation. It's wonderful that all of you are here on a Friday and Saturday talking about what I think is the most pressing public policy topic in the United States. And I think that's true regardless of whatever one's ideological persuasion is, whatever one's religious persuasion is. Immigration is something, as a historian of early America, I would say, has confounded this country since our origins. And therefore, it's no surprise to me, speaking first as an academic before I provoke you, that in 2019, we're having a difficult time figuring out what to do. And I'll say, leading what I think is the largest public policy group outside Washington, D.C., which is nonpartisan. We are center-right, so my perspective is going to be one of a very proud conservative, is that the rhetoric on both sides of this issue is decidedly unhelpful. And so what I'm going to attempt to do, and you can tell me during Q&A if I have limited success, is cut through the rhetoric and walk you through how our organization decided that we were going to actually engage on this issue. For the better part of a decade, we've wanted to do so, but one of the reasons, frankly, we didn't is that we recognized that it was one of those third rails of politics, that if this highly effective public policy organization based in Austin with offices around the country, including Washington, D.C., got involved in that because of some of the reaction we would expect from conservative friends, that in fact, that could be an existential threat, our involvement in this issue. And then about 6 or 7 months ago, I said, to heck with it. This is ridiculous that we're a think tank, that we approach things first by observing the facts, by doing what I like to call reading reality truthfully. The reality on this is that there has to be an organization or a group of organizations that cuts through that rhetoric and offers some solutions. So I will eventually, by the end of this half hour, get to solutions that we've proposed, and I'm hopeful that that will engender a good conversation. Ultimately, as I like to remind people, civil discourse does not require unanimity of opinion. In fact, where we find an absence of the unanimity of opinion is where we find an utter lack of civility. So I look forward to the conversation that ensues. So let me paint a picture for you, which is the picture that we were faced with at our foundation. By the way, I'm not trying to ascribe to the Texas Public Policy Foundation an influence, a level of influence we don't possess. I'm just trying to give you a sense of what many legislators in Texas, members of Congress, members of the administration, and some folks left of center asked us to do. And so this was sort of our thought process. And I think going through this thought process will highlight the tensions that we saw and see in coming up with an effective immigration policy, as well as what I would say as a Louisiana native are some alligators in the water, both for liberals and for conservatives. One of the tensions we found, even though we are a secular organization, is that many of us in senior leadership are faithful Catholics. And so for us, we immediately had this tension, which I'm sure you have at least touched on in your conversations up to this point, which is that the official teaching of the church is of course pro-immigrant, and not just for more immigrants themselves, but to attend to the basic human needs of those immigrants when they come to our country. But then as political conservatives and a few libertarians in the mix, so there are even some open borders people at Texas Public Policy Foundation, we had to put all of those tensions into our conversations and figure out what we were going to say in a way that all of us could support, at least internally. And so I'm going to start with a helpful statement from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, recognizing that the purpose of this conversation today is not to talk about explicitly Catholic stuff, but it gives us some insight into how we got engaged in this issue, but also some insight into really where one of the battlefields is, especially if you think about recent, very unhelpful comments by the Holy Father, Pope Francis. The more prosperous nations, we'll come back to him. The more prosperous nations are obliged, this is paragraph 2241, to the extent they are able, to welcome the foreigner in search of the security and the means of livelihood which he cannot find in his country of origin. Public authorities should see to it that the natural right is respected that places a guest under the protection of those who receive him. Now, for our non-Catholic colleagues at the foundation, they thought that was very helpful. We said, we agree with that. We agree with prosperous nations having a certain obligation that's greater than those that are not prosperous. We agree that we should place any guest under our protection. That's common sense, it's hospitality, but also it implies, if not explicitly confers, an obligation on the country receiving these immigrants to create a system for these immigrants. And also, it's wonderful that the church has been so clear and consistent about this, that there is a recognition that the nation state has limitations to its ability to receive immigrants and to provide for them. And I think that is the point, by the way, that Pope Francis repeatedly misses about countries generally, but about a country he apparently despises in particular, and that's the United States of America. And I say that being very grateful for his leadership in other areas. It's not helpful in this one. Political authorities, the statement continues, for the sake of the common good, may make the right to immigrate subject to various juridical conditions, especially with regard to the immigrant's duties toward the country of adoption, chiefly that they obey its laws. What a beautiful, pithy statement. And I have many atheist friends who are with us on this issue who said, Kevin, probably never will be Catholic, definitely will never be a fan of Pope Francis, but I really appreciate the clarity of the church's teaching there. So if you were to ask me, as the head of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, what is what we call our aspirational there? If we could wave a magic wand on this issue, what would we achieve? And that's the vision. And that surprises a lot of people, because people say you're a free market, conservative, kind of libertarian think tank. Surely you are either totally open borders, or you're totally shut the border down and make sure that there are fewer and fewer immigrants because you're nativists. And my response has always been, how frickin' offensive. We're Texans. This is one of the most, if not the most, successful civil societies in integrating such a diverse people. And not diversity in the sense of what leftists say, but diversity in the sense that you and I live our lives in Texas. That we really don't care where you're from. We don't care what language you speak. We know we're probably going to conduct business in English. That's our custom, and we know we're going to get along. We have no problem intermarrying. We have no problem adopting children of different races. This is what we call Texas, and so that is the reason that the Texas Public Policy Foundation has gotten involved in this issue. And like we have done on criminal justice reform, in which we have convened over 13 years a myriad of groups across the ideological spectrum, from the most lock 'em up, throw away the key kinds of conservatives, Rick Perry, Donald Trump, to the ACLU. What we do is behind the scenes in trying to get those organizations and those elected leaders who can be prone to rhetoric rather than substance to focus on the substance. And that leads me to the first of a couple of key points that I want to drive home. And that is, what is reality about the situation? It's not my desire, at least in 95% of the time that I have with you today, to be hyperbolic. I will be hyperbolic 5% of the time because it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday. So I just have to keep you awake. I'm a nonpartisan leader of a nonpartisan think tank, and so there will be credit and blame assigned to political leaders. We tend in public statements at the foundation not to refer to leaders by name because we work with them behind the scenes, and we happen to believe that our greatest mission is to model civil discourse. And so that's the caveat for saying that regardless of what you think about President Trump, he is the first leader to take action on this in a serious way. And what is this? It is a crisis. We've had about 6 or 7 of our policy leaders, including John Davidson, who writes for The Federalist, has connections here at the University of Dallas, go down to the border. John has gone deep into the interior of Mexico, probably to the point of some danger to his person, to understand the inner workings of what's going on there. As a historian, all I have to do is look at the numbers and I can tell you that there's a crisis. And I'm not using PowerPoint. I know that would probably be helpful, but you've heard the aphorism that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So I'll go easy on the numbers, but I think we can both keep track of three numbers. We have nearly 50 million immigrants to this country in 2017. Fine by me. I love immigrants. Looking around the room, even for those of us who are Caucasian, good thing we're able to immigrate to this country, right? Whether that was last year or in the case of many of our ancestors in the 16, 17, 18, 1900s. But 50 million immigrants destroys on its face the claim that people like Pope Francis makes that this is an anti-immigrant country, especially when you consider that 1/4 of those 50 million came here illegally, immediately. First inch across the southern border, where most of them are crossing, violating the obligation that whether we're Christians, Roman Catholics, belong to some other faith or creed, we understand is the obligation of that person. And on top of that, we had in May of this year, 144,000 people crossed the southern border illegally, just in May alone. For context, 3 years prior, that number in May 2016 was 19,000. Most of them were making inaccurate asylum claims. Now, if I'm in their shoes, I want to be clear. In Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras or Mexico as a head of a household, I might be doing the same thing. I understand that on a human level, and that's where someone like the Pope could be so helpful in reminding Americans, but shoulder to shoulder with us rather than wagging the finger. Because what you see in those numbers is what we know about this country, which is that we are the most generous civil society in the history of the world. We're the most generous civil society to anyone who comes to our shores. And for us at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, the reason we believe that fixing immigration policy starts with greater border security is so that we can continue to be that generous civil society. Because right now, if you were to travel down to the border, even though things have improved some because of action by the Trump administration, you would see in those counties on the American side and those regions and provinces on the Mexican side, bedlam. Civil societies, basically, that don't exist. And the reason they don't exist is because of the fecklessness of political leaders on the American side and the corruption of political leaders south of the border, Republican and Democrat alike. It is our job as think tank academics to call a spade a spade. And it's nice to talk about immigration in Texas because even if we might have some differences of opinion, we at least understand in our day-to-day lives how important immigration is to the civil society that we call Texas. It's much harder to talk about it in Washington, D.C., where segments on each side of the ideological spectrum, the partisans in particular, have something at stake in the status quo. On the left, the status quo drives identity politics. On the right, particularly the far right, there are conservatives, some of them are acquaintances of mine, who are anti-immigrant. And as I have told them face to face, and I've started saying more publicly, their position disgusts me because they're Malthusians at heart. They actually believe that there should be fewer people on the planet, and certainly fewer people in the United States. And only for 240 years have we proven that theory false. And so I think it's really important right now in the United States because we have a left of center apparatus that's moving further and further left, and a right of center apparatus that doesn't know what to do because of the tweeter-in-chief, and good and bad. My wife says, what do you think about President Trump this morning? I said, I'll have to see what he said on Twitter. I'm grateful for the policies, especially as a pro-life guy, but I wish the style were a little bit different. The point is that the time is now for us in the think tank world, and I would presume for you, given your academic positions, even as undergraduate students, to add some substance to the discourse. And so, let's walk through some of the proposals that the Trump administration has discussed and some of the reforms that they have enacted, keeping in mind that because of the level of investment that each side has in the status quo, and because of the really harmful rhetoric from 5% on the left and 5% on the right, just to be fair, that it's difficult to get anything done in Congress. And I will tell you that there are many Republicans in the U.S. House and many Democrats in the U.S. House, just from Texas, who want to get something done. But they can't because of obstacles that are placed in leadership. My hope is that our involvement in this, the foundation's involvement in this, can do what we did for Right on Crime, which was ultimately our criminal justice reform, which has produced the first criminal justice reform in 30 years in the United States that was signed in December by none other than Donald Trump, who used to be a lock 'em up, throw away the key kind of guy. So the biggest problem, because I know that we have limited time and we actually want to have a conversation rather than hear me on my soapbox, is the abuse of asylum. It's in the news again today because another judge who doesn't support the rule of law in Washington, D.C., which is just factually true, I defy you to tell me that's not the case, to prove to me that's not the case, has misread what the administration has done. And I'm not a hack for the administration by any stretch for the imagination. I'm just a historian who reads words and can think. And the administration has perfectly implemented the Flores Agreement. And the judge, because the judge wants that to do something that it doesn't, rejected it again. But over the last few months, as the administration strengthened the migrant protection protocols, we have seen the number of people seeking asylum go down. That's good, because we know liberal sources say this, the real far-right sources say this, I don't think there's any disagreement about this, that up to 80%, some people say 90% of asylum claims are illegitimate. Now, we can leave it to our Thomist friends to decide whether it's moral or immoral for those situations. That's not my job. My job is to look at policy. And what I know is that the repercussions of that abuse of asylum driving up those numbers to putting 1 million people in our immigration courts means that the average length of a court case in immigration court is only 700 days. We're disobeying the rule of law, we're jamming the system, and what are we doing? The exact thing that Pope Francis says we do when we don't have open borders. We are actually harming the people with legitimate claims. And so the reason I'm so passionate about this is because there are people who have legitimate asylum claims. They are legitimately in danger beyond the very understandable motivations to leave economic distress. I understand that fully. And by the way, I hope that once we start getting on real reform, we can expedite their ability to become citizens here. But in the meantime, we have to fix the asylum problem. And so what the administration has done is basically double, or they're in the process of doubling, the number of immigration court judges, which will, I am hopeful, reduce that average length of days for these immigration cases. Just wanted to touch on that because it's important. I'll raise two other elements or aspects of immigration policy that I think often get lost in the rhetoric. And these, again, these might sound hyperbolic. I don't intend them to be so. One is the fact, and my colleague John Davidson has reported on this the best, I think, and you can find most of his stuff at the Federalist, but he's got a paper at our website, texaspolicy.com, that explains this too. We know from data in Mexico and the United States that more and more cartels are shifting their business from drugs to human trafficking. And human trafficking, of course, across the border, which we know exists, but also human trafficking in a different meaning of that term, the way the Texas Attorney General would mean it, which is human sex trafficking. And I think it's really helpful for us across the ideological spectrum to home in on that in particular. as a way of understanding the harms to a civil society and the harms to human persons by not obeying the rule of law. And this is where I think there's an opportunity for people across the spectrum to work together. For example, just in Texas, the Attorney General estimates there are 234,000 victims of labor trafficking in Texas at any given time, and 79,000 victims of youth minor sex trafficking at any given time. We don't know, to be clear, what percentage of those are illegal immigrants. We presume that it's a majority, and one of the things we're trying to do is give you that specific number. But clearly we know that there is a correlation from early studies we've done and studies that other organizations, including the Heritage Foundation, have done. So in fact, the administration reform that has driven down the number of asylum seekers is good. So, looking ahead to solutions, I'll spend the remaining moments I have to give you some insight into what we have proposed and in sort of the chronological order in which we think they should happen. But let me make a comment about the political situation as an observer. No partisan statement here. Many people forget, and sometimes it seems leaders of Congress forget this, that the Supreme Court will rule on the legality of DACA in the first quarter of 2020. And I don't know if you noticed, but there's a presidential election going on next year. And I don't know if you noticed, but it's already hypercharged because of some things that are going on in Washington, D.C. We think that the Supreme Court is more likely than not to rule DACA unconstitutional. The constitutional merits of it are really thin. I happen to support doing something, we support at TPF doing something for the Dreamers. But the point is, that's likely to be the political situation, which is, we believe, reading the tea leaves, because we interact with members of Congress every week, that it's going to provide an opportunity, if not pressure, for them to actually come to the compromise table. And it's interesting to me, again, as an observer, that twice the one political leader people associate with being anti-immigrant, President Trump, went to the compromise table with the House Republicans and the House Democrats, and then Speaker Ryan could only muster about 200 votes for a compromise that included the President of the United States, Mr. Borderwall, willing to compromise on DACA. It shows you the entrenchment on that case, in that specific episode of the left, but of course we know the right is not exactly guiltless in this either. I can tell you another comment about the politics is that increasingly we see in poll after poll a desire by Americans for there to be compromise, and they often see it in the way that we have framed it at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I would like to claim that there's a correlation there. We do a lot of polling and then focus grouping and message testing. We don't spend a lot of money on advertising, so I doubt I can make that claim, but it's nice to see. People understand, American people understand, that it's probably common sense to say we're going to have greater border security because of their assessment that there is, in fact, a crisis. I think the numbers prove that, in exchange for saying, for those 1.8 million people eligible under DACA to remain here, that they remain here. Just make that trade on those two issues. Figure out citizenship down the road, because of course that gets people, especially on the far right, really excited. But get that resolved so that we attend to what is the human crisis, which is an utter lack of border security. And whether that's a wall or drones or our preferred method, which is greater interior enforcement, including Chamber of Commerce business members who love to violate federal and state law and abuse people and also disobey the rule of law. We're not Chamber of Commerce Republicans, by the way. All of that needs to end. The only way we're going to solve the immigration crisis is to recognize that a whole host of people, from business owners to Republicans to Democrats to the corrupt elites in Mexico and Guatemala and Honduras, who actually probably are mostly to blame for this crisis, have to have their little domains changed. Beyond that, we believe that once you make that trade, once you make that reform, that in fact we can get this conversation back to where it needs to be, which is how many immigrants per year, what jobs should they be given visas for, and what is their path to citizenship. And so we are wholeheartedly in favor of the president's move from the lottery system, which is as random as its name suggests, to a system that is more merit-based. Not merit in terms of assigning more or less dignity to human persons around the world, but merit according to where there are absences or needs in certain industries for people who have certain skills. There will always be a place for low-skilled and unskilled workers, but we also understand there's certainly a place in my heart for them. We also understand that those folks, because of their socioeconomic conditions, put a greater burden on the system. I'm not suggesting, especially for those of us who are Christians, that we forget about them, but right now they're a majority of immigration and to Texas from the southern border. That is unsustainable. And especially when, even if we had no immigrants, we would have such a difficult time paying for the dependency state we have created. So we believe that in that situation, we can then be addressing reforms to the black market in labor, which is a huge problem in Texas, frankly. We believe that that will allow us as a nation to become as pro-immigrant as we usually have been, which is where the Texas Public Policy Foundation would love this debate to be. I will tell you as a closing observation, at least in this extended statement, that as pro-immigrant as I am, I do have a worry, and it's a worry that comes from my understanding of American history. And that is every time in American history, every time, like clockwork, that the percentage of immigrants in our population hits 16%. There is political turmoil, which is where it is now. There is political turmoil over immigration policy. And I think that that speaks to the limitations that exist even in this generous society. And that because I want us to continue to be a generous society, I want us first and foremost to obey the rule of law and for both political and religious leaders to recognize that in the United States of America, of all places, that's the first way to fix our immigration policy. Thank you.